Okay, Zach, so to start things off, I thought I would quiz you with an honest rules question that came
Oh,
up
God.
in a historic
This is-
event that I played.
Fuck, this sounds terrible.
And and I'm going to put you on the clock because remember, I'm under Arena's clock while I'm trying to figure
Okay,
out.
so the rope
So
is
there's
going.
one. Yeah. So, opponent has a Narset in play, and you intend to cast Magma Opus.
Okay.
The first part of your Magma Opus deals 4 damage, three of which will be targeted at Narset and will kill the Narset. Later on, your Magma Opus says draw 2 cards. Question I have for you is, do you draw 2 cards or not?
I'm going to say yes.
Okay. Why are you saying yes?
I'm saying yes because in Arena, you will have to target all the different things in a specific order, which is the order that it is in the card. And then the card will resolve in that same order. So by the time you draw the 2 cards, Narset will be off of the field.
Okay. That is what I thought as well. Turns out, it is not correct. I did not get to draw 2 cards off my Magma Opus. So I let the Narset resolve intentionally, thinking I'll just kill it with Magma Opus, which, looking back, is a bad play, because if my opponent just doesn't activate it, then I can't kill it, because it's at 5 loyalty. But both me and my opponent made a misstep. Well, actually, if my opponent knew about the rule, then they didn't. But okay, so I was like, I'll let Narset resolve, I'll kill it, and draw 2 cards. What happened was, I targeted the Narset, I resolved the spell, Narset flashed, then it died, then I tapped the 2 things I was tapping, and then I made a 4/4, and then no cards were drawn. So, anyways, I was like not 100% sure that I would draw the cards, but I thought pretty sure I would, and I'm under the Arena clock, right? So I had to make the decision. I ended up losing that game, and that was one of the matches I lost. And this was in the 7th round of the event, I think. Mm-hmm. So this very well could have cost me top 8. Now, I lost that game 2-0, so there's no guarantee I would have lost the match. Or sorry, lost the match 2-0, so no guarantee I would have won the third game. But I certainly would have won that game if I had either known the rule or been correct about how the rule worked. And so I went to the geniuses of Reddit to answer my question.
That sounds sketch already, but okay, cool.
Yeah, I went to the MTG Rules Reddit. They explained to me that a planeswalker dying due to having 0 loyalty is a state-based effect or state-based action, which only gets checked at certain times.
Okay.
Which means that even though I killed the Narset as the first part of the card, the game hasn't registered that Narset has gone to the graveyard yet because it died due to having 0 loyalty. And it will check that after the spell resolves. So, what this means is that if the first part of the card says destroy target planeswalker, then it would work as we thought. Because it will destroy the planeswalker, that's not state-based, so that will be known instantly, and I'll draw 2 cards at the end. Because it has to do with loyalty, it's kind of like toughness. So the way they explained it to me is if you had a creature whose power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in your hand, and then you cast Wheel of Fortune, that creature will not die, even though you discard your whole hand. So there's a point where it should have 0 toughness.
And then draw. Okay. All right, that does make sense. I 100% would not have thought that.
Yeah, I thought the same as you, and it cost me that game.
Hello, and welcome to episode 27 of the Arena Regulars podcast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Jeff.
And we're your source for weekly drunken Magic the Gathering arena content.
Yeah, basically we're just 2 regular dudes drinking highly irregular beer and talking about Magic the Gathering, in particular Magic the Gathering Arena, and sometimes we'll tip our hats towards competitive play.
Yes, we do. And this week we have a very special episode that we have been talking about for a very long time. This is our episode detailing how to brew. Very, very exciting. But first, before we get right into that, each week we both bring a beer, we drink our own, then drink... Wait a second. Nope, there's something different about this week. I think I'm going to throw it over to you. Jeff, what's on tap?
Well, this week we're, we had such success with our tap takeovers where we both drink beers that were made by the same people. We thought we might do it again for this special How to Brew episode. And, if we're going to do that, we might as well put our money where our mouth is and show that we know how to brew. So today, we're both drinking a beer that I made.
Yeah!
So we have the same beer. There's only one, but we're both drinking it. I made it. It's been sitting around for a while now, but yeah, I think I made it like 2 months ago, maybe.
Yeah.
And it takes about a month to ferment, and then here it is.
Yeah. So Jeff, tell us about the beer. What is it?
All right. So
yeah.
As you people who listen to the show know, we both really like red ales or ambers, whatever you want to call them, right? Beers that are just kind of regular ales with a bit of a reddish hue that have a bit more body to them. So that's what I set out to make. The grains I used are just standard grains, so 2-row. For those who know, 2-row, Cara 40 and Cara 80. And those last two just give it that red color, and the 2-row is kind of the bulk. Then I went a little wild with the hops. I used something called Atsaka and something called Bravo. Bravo's mostly for bittering, but Atsaka is supposed to give it some sort of like tropical fruit notes in the aroma. So I used a very small amount of that just to see if we could get just a tinge. You don't want too much because it doesn't really match with the style that well, but I felt like it would just make it kind of subtle. And then I went with a Scottish yeast, which I'd never used before, but I'm really happy with it. I went with it because it's supposed to accentuate the body rather than the hops. And like I said, red ales are supposed to traditionally focus on the body. So this should be like a body forward, little bit of sweetness to it, and then just some bitterness coming from a small amount of hops that I used.
Yeah, and I have to say, this is my first sip of it. I've been waiting to drink this beer for quite a long time, and I'm very, very excited. And it's real tasty, which we might rate it later. We might not. Who knows? It depends how much we drink of it. How drunk we get, we will. Well, if you listen to the show before, you know what happens at the end. So,
yeah. And those of you listening, unfortunately, you can't see this beer, but I think this is one of the best looking beers I've ever made. It actually came out exactly how I wanted.
Yeah, it looks fantastic, and yeah, it's Anyway,
it's like a deep red.
Yeah, check out our Instagram. It's at Arena Regulars. There should be a picture, but it's just, I'm not a photographer, so the picture might not look as great as the beer does in person. But
yeah.
Anyway.
Well, hold on. Every great beer deserves a great name.
Oh, yes, of course. Sorry.
So I've decided to call this beer. Are you ready? You ready for the name?
Okay.
This beer is called Red Beer Wins.
Ah! Oh, that's so good. Oh, it definitely does win. Oh, that's awesome. Red beer wins. Ooh. Okay. Anyway, so going into the episode, Magic news. We had some not a lot of arena talk this last week, but there has been this giant super secret layer drop, which has some people talking. Usually this doesn't really affect arena. However, sometimes we do get the like alt art of cards or different things in arena. So we like
sleeves sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes sleeves or that kind of stuff. There was some like the extra life cards. We had some altars that you could get from random streamers or different people. So look out for those things. But Jeff, what's the most exciting of those that we could possibly get on arena? I think. Well, what most people are talking about, I guess.
The basic lands.
Yeah.
There's a secret layer there. You get 5 basic lands. You get mountain, you get island, you get plains, you get swamp, and if you're a diehard competitive player, you get forest. Too.
Yeah, you do. You get all of those. I will have to say the art is pretty terrible on those.
It's lacking.
It's lacking art. So the joke has been, I don't know who made it. It was like a judge or something. I don't know, but there has been this image kind of going around Magic forever of just like a full text basic land that has all the judge ruling words on it it's kind of like 22 lines, I think, of text that just says like
it's super type and describes what that means.
Yeah, and it like it tells you how it taps and what a mana pool is and how mana will leave at the end of phases and all that kind of stuff. So all the like kind of technical like rules lawyer stuff. So it's kind of
mana does not pass priority. Like I don't remember what's actually on the card.
Yeah, but stuff like that. So it's it is pretty funny just being able to see it and it's actually real and you can buy it. Where before
now they've made it.
Yeah,
these lands have no art. It's just a text box that describes everything you might ever want to know about basic lands.
Yeah, I guess maybe the first time they made this up was, I think, Unglued was the first unset, and that was the first time they had full art lands.
Right.
Or I guess there's a pretty thick border on those. They're not what we know as full art, really. But
so this is a joke about full art lands, obviously going in the exact opposite direction.
Full text.
I think they're pretty funny.
I think they're pretty funny too.
I don't know if I would use them, and I definitely don't know if I would spend money to get, one of each of them, whatever comes in that secret layer. But I hope it's more than one. But if it's one of each, like most secret layers are just one of each card, right?
Yeah, I think it's each. It's like that, but you can get a bundle and get 10 of them for a lot of money. I don't know. I have seen that the foiling treatment on that is actually pretty interesting because the foil has like the mana symbol. Really,
they put it in foil.
Yeah, but the mana symbol,
no art,
where normally it would be, is like foiled. So when you look at it, you can see like the forced symbol in the foil.
Gotcha.
So that looks kind of cool, and that's like the reason you would get foil.
You got to do something because the reason people get foils is for the art. It makes it foil.
Or all the words are kind of popping out. It's like etched, gold etched.
Get your
words.
3D glasses.
Yeah. Anyway, those are not things that happen on Arena, but if they happen to give us that as like an alternate art or something, or just a regular basic land you could use, that'd be pretty sweet. Because I only need one of those to fill my whole deck, which would be great. Yeah, but besides that, they just felt very uneventful, which was great. It
was too uneventful. It's got to be the calm before the storm. I expect a Twitter eruption next week over something.
So there is that.
Peaceful.
I mean, like, there's a league weekend. It doesn't really matter. We'll get some stuff. But after having, like, just weeks and weeks and weeks of spoilers or new cards or new things coming out and all, just a barrage, it was nice to have a chill week. So with that, how was your week? How'd your Arena week go?
It went great, actually. Over the weekend, I played in a tournament. This was the historic 5K that was run by Insight Esports.
Ooh, very cool.
Which I almost didn't even play in. I was debating between that or the SCG Satellite, which was also at 1 p.m. But I felt like I wanted to play Historic, so then I went for the Historic one. Even though I hadn't played much Historic beforehand. So I could do a super quick tournament report. I ended up playing Jeskai Control.
Okay.
And there was a few reasons, but I felt like a lot of people would bring Gruul because everyone was kind of messing around with these weird strategies that are a bit dirtily. So I felt like a lot of people would bring Gruul to try to prey on the people who didn't know what they were doing. And you know what beats the crap out of Gruul? One of my all-time favorites, Lightning Helix. So
Yay!
I wanted to play 4X Lightning Helix, and I wanted to find the deck that did that the best. And the other reason that I picked Jeskai Control was that if you don't know that much about what's going on in a format, I like playing Control because it tends to play the same way in every format. Like, if you're at the controllingest end of the spectrum, the types of decisions you have to make are the same regardless of what other people are playing. Against aggro, you have to survive to turn the game around, so on and so forth. So I felt like it would be easiest to pilot a control deck given that I don't know the intricacies of the metagame.
All right. I think that makes sense. Yeah.
I mean, it made sense to me, so I just went for it. And then this deck that I played has Gear Hulk plus Magma Opus as its win con, which I really like because part of the problem with historic control decks in the past has been they don't close the game fast enough, and because the other control decks the other decks in the format are so resilient, sometimes you'll wipe the board, untap, and have 5 cards in hand and still not win. You know? So I like to just be able to really turn the corner and put the game out of reach for your opponent before they start drawing 2 collected companies in a row or something.
Or something like that. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I'm the one that gets their board wiped and then fills the field the next turn, or you know, all the cards came back. They have to have 2 wipes in a row or something. So
right now, if it's like board wipe into Gear Hulk, getting back Magma Opus the following turn, there's pretty much no coming back.
Yeah,
so
exactly. So awesome.
Yeah, so I want to just say that I got my list from Star City Games. Shaheen Surani posted it, and there were 2. I thought I was going to have to take a list and then change it because there were 2 things I was adamant about if I was going to play Jeskai. One was I was not going to play Brainstorm, and the second one was I really wanted to play Doomscar.
Okay.
So I wanted no Brainstorm because I just don't think it belongs in the deck. And I see people complaining like, oh, this deck's no good because it's so hard to cast Anger of the Gods on turn 3. And I'm like, yeah, the reason is because you're playing Fabled Passage, so your mana base is garbage, and you're only playing Fabled Passage to make Brainstorm not bad. So just don't play Brainstorm.
Yeah.
That seems like the obvious solution. But people like are so into Brainstorm that doesn't even register to them.
Yeah, like that's, well, I'm playing blue.
Cut the Brainstorm so that their mana can get much better.
Yeah, I have to do that. Very interesting. I like that.
And then Doomscar I really think you need because in this format in particular, a lot of the aggro decks run Collected Company. So a turn 4 Wrath of God is just going to get hit by End Step Coco. So it's like, you really need that turn 3 Wrath. And so that's why I played 1 Anger and 2 Doomscar, and then 1 Wrath of God.
Interesting.
But then when I was reading that article, Shaheen said those exact things. He said Brainstorm's not that good in the deck and it makes the mana too bad, and Doomscar is better than Wrath of God, and he posted the list. I was like, all right, well, I guess we're just running with this.
There you go. I will like to point out that when we are doing our Worth a Slot episode, and I said Doomscar in Historic, and you're like, really? In Historic? You're going to play that over Wrath of God? I'm like, it could be better. So just reminding you.
I've changed my mind. Specifically right now with all the Coco.
Yeah.
But I went 6-2.
Hey.
So, yeah,
that's
that
awesome.
was good enough for 14th place. So 6-2. I think 7th and 8th place were 6-2. So I was kind of tied for 7th, but on breakers I finished 14th. One of my losses was to Luis Salvato, a Rivals League player, who ended up winning the whole tournament. So you know, can't feel too bad about that one.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is like to get into that top 8, Luis was also 6-2. Right.
Yeah.
And
so Luis was 6-2, but had better breakers.
Yeah.
Partially because he beat me, and then I did well.
Exactly. So look at you. You see, without you, Luis would not be able to win the whole thing. So I think that's kind of a, you get a nice notch or something.
And PV was 6-2, so I got the same record as him. And then actually, when I was checking again, right below me, 15th place, was Arna Hushembet, also at 6-2. So you might remember him from recently winning the Kaldheim Championship.
Yeah.
So I was in good company with the 6-2 record there.
Well, there you go. Hey, you can't really argue with that. That's, you know, getting the same record as some of the best players in the game. Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I mean, that's so cool. It makes me want to play in one of those Insight esports things that I've been seeing.
They're a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. Yeah. And Historic was just a lot of fun. I played against a lot of different decks.
Yeah.
I did play against Gruul 2 or 3 times, so I'm happy that I went with
nice
Lightning Helix, because that really gets him.
That's awesome. Yeah. I haven't actually been playing a ton of Constructed. I was playing a lot of Draft still. It's just, I still, every time I open up the client, I'm like, oh, do I have enough gold? Oh, I do. Okay, I'm going to draft. Maybe I'll have enough to keep drafting and just keep doing that over and over again. So,
well, hey, the Arena Open's coming up in a couple of weeks.
I know. Getting excited for that. But yeah, anyway, I think it's time to unveil the meat of the episode and something we've wanted to talk about for a while. So this is how to brew in two meanings of the word.
Yes.
If you haven't thought about it. So basically, Jeff, why did we want to have this episode in the first place?
Well, I've always enjoyed brewing decks. For me, it's one of the most fun parts of Magic. And so, I've been doing it for a long time. I don't know if I'm the best brewer in the world, but I would like to talk a little bit about how I go about it. Because I've talked to people about it too, and some people just, I think, have different expectations about how it works. They think they'll just slap something together and immediately take on the tier 1 decks with no problem, right? Which is unfortunately not really the reality of the situation.
And as a podcast, we harp a lot about net decking and how that isn't a terrible thing, and you should definitely use that. It's a tool in your wheelhouse. Do not be afraid of that. Right. And also, we've talked about how, as this thing goes by, we have talked about how important it is to actually be a good player and know how to play your deck very well, whether you built it or you got it offline or whatever, and that it's not just the deck that you play, it's also how you play. However, now we finally want to sit down. We haven't done this before, but we want to talk about how to actually make a deck.
Yeah, from scratch or otherwise.
Yeah.
And when I was kind of sitting down and trying to synthesize, it into an actual step-by-step process of sorts, I realized that a lot of the steps could easily kind of overlap with how you actually make real beer. So we thought it'd be fun to kind of give the steps to brewing magic in terms of how you would brew beer.
Exactly. So we have boiled this down, into 6 neat little handy steps. But before we start this, this is also a fun thing. It was just a great way of talking about your new deck, right?
Right.
You could, if someone's asking you like, oh, where are you with that deck you were building? You will now, after you listen to this, have a specific place. You could be like 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, or 6. That's not that fun. We have some fun names for that. So you'd be like, oh, it's this, which, well, you'll learn soon. So
we'll get to them.
But let's just start right off at the beginning with the first step, which would be
the recipe. So in this phase, basically, what is the deck? What's your idea? And this could be anything, right? So maybe you just really like a specific card from the new set. You want to try to find a deck that optimizes, makes the best use of that card because you think it's very powerful or whatever. Or you realize there's a synergy between 2 or 3 different cards and you really want to build that out into a deck, right? Whatever you want. The one thing I will say, though, is that I think the most important part is to actually have a reason that you're building this deck. Like, I know a lot of people that'll be like, I'm just going to build Mardu mid-range or whatever and go in and build Mardu mid-range. And that's okay, but I think you should, if you're honest about the reason you're building the deck, it'll make the stuff that's going to come later more palatable, I think.
Yeah.
So your reason can be, this just seems fun to me, or I just like this color combo, and I want to see what the best deck I can make in that color combo. I'm not saying that you have to sit down and be like, oh, I'm going to build a deck that hard counters Gruul Adventures because I think that's going to be over 40% of the metagame at an upcoming event.
And blah, blah,
that's
blah.
My reason. That's a reason, too, for sure. Mm-hmm. But your reason doesn't have to be that analytical. It can just be, this seems fun, I really like this, or this card is awesome, I want to play with this card.
Exactly.
Or even just, I have this card. I opened 4 of this rare or mythic rare, and I want to build a deck around that because I have it.
It could be like, hey, I played the sealed event, and these were the rares I opened, and man, I thought that deck was really fun. I did well with it. I want to see if I can make that in standard, kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
The main point is just being specific and knowing why you're doing it, just so your kind of expectations are in line with what you're hoping to achieve.
That's actually a really good point that you just brought up as a good reason, and it's one that affects me a lot, is when I know a deck has been successful in another format, and I'm starting to see similar pieces come in. Like, Historic is the perfect breeding ground for this, where I know there are decks in the past in Standard that were really good, and that set just got added to Historic, so I'm excited to try that deck. Or I know there's a deck in Modern that's really good, and as cards get added into Historic, it looks like that deck might be coming together in Historic.
Or that strategy or something, and it's like the first...
A similar...
Yeah. Sometimes, like literally with you, and you were talking about last episode, seeing Stone Rain is a mystical archive card, and you're like, oh, sick, I could play this deck from Modern, let's see if I can. And then you
Exactly.
work on
Yeah,
that.
that's a really common reason for me personally that comes up a lot because, partially because I've been playing for a while, so I've played in a lot of these past standards, and it's just cool when you remember, oh, that deck was awesome. Let's see if I can build anything like that.
So yeah, it just means that like we don't want you to go into this thinking this is how you build the best deck. This is just how you build a deck and decks, and that like there are probably more steps than you would originally think about, because a lot of times your idea tends to be the entire thing. Like it's your idea, and then you take a pass,
you slap it together,
and see what happens. And then you're like, well, that didn't work, or whatever. And you're like, well, there could be some other things that you need to do before you abandon it or not. But I do think the first thing, just like starting out, knowing what your objective is good, because maybe your objective is just, I like playing blue-black, and so I'm going to make some blue-black deck and have fun.
Yeah, and what you should understand, and you can still try to make it as good as you can and take it to competitive events. I used to do that all the time when I couldn't afford, tier 1 standard decks. But you do have to understand that by kind of saying, oh, I just like this color pair, or I just like this card, you are putting yourself at a bit of a disadvantage, because other players are just taking whatever deck they think is best, using any cards, and not restricting themselves by color pair or by card. So if you admit to yourself, hey, here's the reason I'm doing it, I can't afford a tier 1 deck, but I still want to have a good deck, or I just love playing blue-black, it'll help, when you start losing some games later, which will happen, it'll help you kind of just accept that I know that I'm kind of an underdog at this beginning, because my deck is brand new, I have to work on it, and other people are just playing Gruul Adventures.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe your idea is, hey, I hate rogues so much, I'm going to build a deck that never loses to rogues.
No, nobody feels like that.
But that can be
4 Kroxa, 4 Ox of Agonis, 4 Phoenix of Ash.
That can be your reason. Whether you actually get to run into that deck enough that you feel like you've achieved your
every
goal.
time you do that, you never run into rogues again.
You're
and then MTG Goldfish will tell you it's half the meta, but you still just
never see it. But sometimes that's how I started building some of my first decks when I was a kid. Was, oh well, my best friend plays slivers, so I have to play a deck that kills slivers or something. Like that's the only thing that you're focused on is, well, my meta is my friend group and this actually still happens in Commander too. So like sometimes you just build a deck that like, I hate losing to their deck that's like that. I'm going to play anti whatever that deck is. And that's fun. And then you might build that and then play with it and realize, oh, maybe that's not the way I should be building decks, but you can still do it,
It still works.
And then when you eventually abandon it, you're like, well, it did what it was supposed to do. That was really fun. And I can move on to new things now. I did want to point out real quick that if you are building something, quote unquote, from scratch, it doesn't have to necessarily be from scratch. And we had touched on this, just saying, oh, hey, if there's a deck you used to like and some of the pieces are in Historic or something, you can try to put that back together. But it also relates to looking things up online and
for sure
researching things. So like, Jeff, when you were making your beer, you just picked up some things that you had laying around, right? That you just like found at the grocery store, and you just kind of threw it together, and you saw what came out. Is that accurate?
No, that's not correct. No, I didn't just go to a big grain store and be like, let's see, 6 pounds of that, 1 pound. No, I looked up how other people's red amber ale recipes have looked, and to get a good idea of how much of each ingredient approximately. And we called this the recipe, right? And this is how I use any recipe. If I want to cook something for dinner that I haven't made before, or I've only made once or twice, I look up 4 or 5 different recipes for that thing. From that I can see what's the ingredient that's in all of them, and what are things that are specific to the cook's taste. And so then from that I know my recipe has to have these core things going on, and I can adjust these other things, right? So it's the same thing here, You can just look up to see if anyone else has built a deck like this before. There's nothing wrong with that. And when you're looking over their list, you can find the stuff that you like about it and the stuff that you don't like about it. And after you look at a few different lists, then you'll have a good idea of how to start your shell. And what the great thing that happens is you'll just see a card that you didn't think of. This happens every time because there are thousands of Magic cards. You can't possibly think of every one that's going to be good in a specific archetype, you know? So that's what I would actually recommend you pretty much always do this, rather than, like, you can just throw it together on Arena and try to learn from it totally on your own. That's also fine, but I'd say eventually I would think you would want to look up a few different deck lists of what other people are doing with the archetype to get some ideas.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean, like, just because a deck list is online doesn't mean it's the best way to make that deck, right? You could still have an input into it, and you taking it and putting your own spin on it, or maybe you added a color that wasn't there before that you thought would be interesting, or whatever you figured out or realized that, oh, I could do it this way. That's also viable, and then you could take that list eventually, once we go through these steps, post it online, and then maybe somebody else will be inspired to do something. So I think the stigma behind, ever looking at a deck list online, sometimes it feels like, oh, your virgin eyes have seen the cards, and now you could never brew that because
now you are not honorable.
Yeah, or something. It just seems so, I don't know, old school, weird. I don't know what that is, but use it to your advantage. I mean, sometimes
right.
you'll find new stuff. Maybe they didn't see stuff that you see, right? It's not like you find something online that means it's a brick and mortar. It's done. There's always room to grow. So that's what I have to say about that.
it's like talking to people about the deck, right?
Yeah.
They say, oh, have you tried this card? You're like, no, I didn't think of that. That's happened to all of us, right? This is like doing that. It's just that you're kind of, instead of having a conversation with them, you're looking at their list and say, oh, they're basically saying, here are the cards I like for the deck. Have you considered them?
Yeah,
and you might find one or two that you're like, no, I didn't think of that. That sounds great.
So research, a big important part about having an idea for your deck, I would say. Though before we get to the next step, something that's extremely important to do, that I always forget to do, or maybe I just always prepare myself this way. I don't know which one it is.
Yeah.
But you had written down that, like, an important part of brewing beer is to sanitize everything and make sure everything's clean.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the most important things, is just making sure everything is sanitized before you use anything. And while you're going through, you'll be constantly sanitizing any new
Exactly. Because you don't want mold to grow. You don't want any bad, funky stuff to start poking its head out of different places.
You'll even just get off flavors if you don't.
Just like weird things. You'll get a bad taste in your mouth is what you'll get.
Exactly.
And so how does this relate to brewing Magic cards, Jeff?
Well, I was thinking that, so the sanitize everything step is about getting ready for what's to come, okay? So I usually have a big bucket that I fill with sanitized water, like sanitized solution watered down. And then I put all of everything I'm going to use in that big bucket. And I'm going to use the bucket too, so this is a way to sanitize everything at the same time. So it's just so that when I'm actually brewing, I don't have to, oh crap, I need this spoon, it's not sanitized, I have to sanitize it now. And so it's about getting ready for what's to come. And in this case, I would say that means getting mentally ready for the process of brewing. Because, well, what's going to happen when you brew a brand new deck and jump into a established metagame full of tier 1 decks that the hive mind and the best players in the world have worked on for months?
You're going to lose a lot.
Yeah, you're going to lose a lot.
A lot. Take the number of times you're going to lose that you have in your mind, whatever it is, and just, double it, triple it. Just like,
right.
Just be prepared to never, ever win and always lose, basically. Because you're going to go into this, if you start to think, oh, this is the best thing I've ever created, blah, blah, all this stuff, and then if you get discouraged really quickly and you start to get a bad taste in your mouth, you'll kind of push away from it and you'll never work on it again and just throw it away and be like, well, that was stupid. And then you might get hard on yourself. And really, that's just, you're at the beginning stages right here. Like, you need to, there are 5 more steps you got to get through before you're ready. So just keep going.
Yeah, just because you lost 3 games in a row to Gruel Adventures doesn't mean the idea of your deck was bad.
Yeah, that's actually a good thing, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
So sanitizing is just like kind of it's a disclaimer. It's like, hey, just don't forget.
And just on the same
yourself.
note, when you lose to somebody playing a tier 1 deck and you're playing a brew, don't like disparage them. Don't get mad at them for quote unquote net decking and think you're playing honorably and they're playing dishonorably and it's their fault that you lost because they didn't do the right thing and build a deck from scratch or whatever. Like that attitude, I don't know where it came from, but it has to go.
Yeah. That feels like an old school, like that attitude started in 1993 and it stayed there. It should stay there.
It should stay there, exactly.
So
there's nothing wrong with playing Gruul Adventures on the ladder.
Exactly.
Or Jameer Rogues.
And if you've had, you started with your idea and you're prepared yourself, that's going to happen, and you want that to happen to know what you should keep and what you shouldn't keep. Which brings us to step number 2, which in the brewing process is called the mash.
Yes. So we'll just go through the actual brewing process real quick. The mash is basically when you put your grains, so all the grains that I've decided, in my case it was 2-row and then the caramel malts to give it a red color. You basically put it into a giant cooler and then you put warm, hot water, not boiling, but hot water in with the grains. You close your cooler, you hold that temperature for like an hour, sometimes 90 minutes. Sometimes even a bit more than that. So you're basically steeping all the grains in a hot liquid, like you would a tea or something. What this does is it extracts the sugars out of the grains and into the water. And the plan is that water, that I usually call it sweet barley water, is now what's going to become your beer, and the grains will be discarded.
Mm-hmm. So in Magic terms, this is basically like that moment when you're like, you had the idea, you did your research, and now you have gotten into Arena and you're just throwing cards together. You're like, all right, this is my main idea. I still need 45 more cards. Okay, well, I'm going to add some of these. And then maybe some of these numbers are weird. Oh, I would want 4 of these, but I only have 2. So I'll do 2. And then there's going to be a replacement card. And, you're just kind of throwing things together to look good. And this also says sacrifice a creature. So I'm going to throw that in here. That says make extra creatures, throw that, all that kind of stuff. That's your mash. You're just mashing things together and just trying to get some semblance of deck, some sort of base, right, is what you're working on.
Yeah, and this is where you have a bunch of one-ofs because you don't know which cards are good and which cards are bad yet. You have, your mana base might be a bit sketchy at this point.
Well, as far as numbers go, hopefully you have the mana base because that, eventually you're going to have to get those. But
you're not playing 12 forest, 5 mountain, and 7 islands or anything.
Yeah.
But,
or just like, you're not just playing like lifelands or something like that. But because we would advocate that you always use your wild cards for your lands first. But
I would say at this stage, don't use a wild card on a rare land for this deck. If you only have 3 triomes, just go with 3 for now.
And
these specific numbers on the mana base won't matter that much.
Exactly. Sorry, what I meant to say is that I would hope you'd already have those lands from just
me too.
But anyway, this is kind of the time when you're, this is a lot of the times the only step people take when they're building a deck, and that was we're trying to like break people out of, is that you throw your idea together, it has some kind of shamblings of a deck, and then you test it out. You're like, all right, let's just go. And then that is the moment where you're like, oh, it sucks. And you just discard it and get rid of it forever. We don't want you to do that.
So what you've written here is in this stage, this is where you figure out which cards are the sugars that you're going to keep in your final beer and which is the spent grain to be discarded.
Yes.
Right? To tie it all together.
Exactly. So we're looking for the sugars. And the sugars is probably your engine if you have some sort of, it's the main reason you built the deck. Right, the core of like, I like this card and it works with this card. All right, I know those are sugars. What other cards I added are also sugars that I want to keep, and which are the grains I want to discard? Right. It is important to note this is a time when you don't have a sideboard. Don't think about your sideboard.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, if you have like a black deck, I'll just slap 4 duress in the sideboard because I know that my whatever removal spells I have are gonna have to come out against Sultai, and duress is good. Or I'll put some generic graveyard hate or like but I won't really build a sideboard. I'll just put cards that I know tend to be pretty good in these color. Oh, I'm playing blue. I'll put Mystical Dispute.
Yeah,
in the sideboard.
Your sideboard ends up being like 8 cards or something random. Just like it's just 4 copies of whatever.
And it's not that well thought out because you don't know what cards you need yet.
Yeah,
so.
and you don't know what cards you don't want in your deck and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so the important part here is that you put that all together and now you're playing games. Okay, you're getting out into the wild. You're jumping on the ladder. You have the world's sketchiest sideboard. Sometimes I play with no sideboard at all. And then you're just seeing what happens. You're not trying to win necessarily. Obviously, you are trying to win. But you should expect, this is what we were talking about, in this stage you should expect to lose quite a bit. But you're trying to figure out what are the card interactions that I have here that are strong, which ones are not as good as I thought they were. And actually one thing that tends to happen a lot is this card doesn't work the way that I thought it did.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely put this in as graveyard hate, but it doesn't do some of the things I want. I was thinking, maybe this would also exile my graveyard against rogues. But it actually doesn't do that. Whoops.
You're talking about Soul Guide Lantern.
I sure am. But sometimes, that just happens, especially when there's a new set and you want to brew with some of the cards. You're like, oh, sweet. Throw that in the deck. You're like, oh, I didn't realize how... recently, I was really loving Elite Spellbinder. So I'm like, sweet, I just want to play this card as much as possible. And then I also liked Strict Proctor. I was like, oh, sweet, this card's cool too, blah, blah. And then when you play them together, you're like, oh, shit. I tax my own ETBs, and so it turns off almost the rest of my deck by playing this, and then I have to side out all this other stuff. I was like, okay, this is kind of frustrating. Maybe these cards don't work as well together as I was hoping. Maybe I just...
Yeah, it's a good example, because on the surface, they're both white taxing creatures. And so you're like, I could play like a white style, Death and Taxes style deck, but then you're like, wait a minute. This Strict Proctor stops PV's ETB.
So then I'm just playing a 3-mana 3/1 flyer. That's not what I want it for. And then you're like, okay, so maybe I just don't play with these cards together. Maybe they're different strategies. And then...
Or one's in the sideboard or something.
And then once, you play with it once and you make the mistake and you're like, whoops. But then usually I continue, the point of that game wasn't to win. So after I make that mistake, I just emote oops, and then I keep playing the game because... I learned something new.
Sure, you're gonna learn more.
I learned something new about that card, and I made note of that. And then I continue to play to see if I can make as many mistakes as possible that are just card based, like, oh, that was supposed to do this, my bad, or any of that stuff. That's what I'm looking for.
Exactly.
This is supposed to happen right now. So big thumbs up if I make a mistake and I can make a note of it and be like, okay, I should have done this instead, or this card should be replaced with anything else. Just any other card would be better than this one.
Right. And often you'll have so many cards that you wanted to try that some of them didn't have room, or you could only play one of them. You'll say, well, now that I have this free space from the 2 Strict Proctors that I'm getting out of here, let's try out those other cards.
Exactly. So... And
I remember one time watching Reed Duke streaming, and I'm sorry to bring a non-arena thing into this, but he was brewing in Modern. And he was brewing like some sort of green-black mid-range deck, as he's known to do from time to time. And I remember one of the chatters had the question, like, why do you only have 2 Tarmogoyfs in this list? And he said, well, I know how good Tarmogoyf is. I know what Tarmogoyf does, and I know that in the end it's going to be a 4-of in my deck. But in these games, I want to figure out what other cards are good. So I'm only going to have 2 of them, because I don't want to just beat my opponent down with Tarmogoyfs, because I know that angle of the deck. I want to test out other cards. I want to draw my other cards that I'm testing more often, and so on and so forth. I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
That makes a lot of sense.
So then somebody asked, why do you have Tarmogoyf in the deck at all? For those of you who don't know, Tarmogoyf is just a 2-drop that is very big. That's basically... So why do you have Tarmogoyf in the deck at all, then? You could test more cards without Tarmogoyf. And then he said, well, if I test cards without a card that I know is going to be a big part of the final deck, there might be an interaction that I miss. There might be something that exiles my graveyard that I think is great, and then I forget that makes my Tarmogoyf a 0/1, and so those cards don't play together.
Yeah.
So that's exactly the kind of thing you should be doing right now is in this process. And, it's Reed Duke approved, so...
Yeah, that's great. I had not heard that before. I like that quite a bit. Because I haven't even thought about that angle of just like, hey, this card that I love that I'm definitely going to have in the deck, I'll just play less of it so that I can see what the other cards do.
Yeah.
That's
that one I know is 4 of at the end. That's fine. But I have to play some amount of it, otherwise I'll miss interactions between the new cards and the old cards.
So maybe that's part of your adventure package if you happen to be brewing around that.
Sure.
You're like, hey, I know the adventure package is what it does. I'm going to take a couple of those cards out. I don't need to have 4 Lovestruck Beasts. I'll have less, or Bone Crushers or whatever, and see what some other cards could do instead. I like that quite a bit. That's good.
Yeah, so I have a few decks in here. I wanted to furnish examples, but I have so many decks in the recipe phase currently that I couldn't possibly list them all. But I have a couple of decks that I consider to be in the mash. One I actually brewed since I played Jeskai Control and Historic over the weekend. I just started thinking to myself, couldn't I play this in Standard? Like, we have Prismari Command, which is a great card, Magma Opus, and Alrund's Epiphany at the top end, and let's just see if we can make a Jeskai Control deck built around that. So I built that, and that deck is literally just 2-0 right now. I don't know how I managed to win those games, but I did. They were very close. I'm just having a lot of fun with it, but hey, it's round 2. I have a ton of 1-ofs, and in my last game I just realized Rowan and Will is awesome in the deck, and I probably want more than 1 copy. So when I next go into it, I'm going to find whatever card was impressing me the least and replace it with another copy of Rowan and Will. Because, hey, they make your Alrund's Epiphany and Magma Opus more attainable.
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds fun, too.
It's pretty sweet. I'm going to keep testing it out. I really like Narset of the Hidden and or Ancient Way. I can't remember. Because she discards things and deals damage equal to their mana value.
Yeah.
So when you have Magma Opus and Alrund's Epiphany, you can take out pretty much anything.
Love that. Yeah, that's awesome. It also is just important to note during the mash phase that if you do big overhauls or something of the deck, you're just basically starting over. So that's totally fine if you do that. But know that within each game, you can make a note of that. Go in, change it, come back out, play another match. Play that match, you find something else, go out, change something.
Yeah, I think you should be changing constantly. Because, hey, if you take something out, you can always bring it back in.
Yeah. And even because I can get stuck in the loop of just I'm just going to play this deck. I'm just trying to jam games because I just want to jam games. And then I have played the same deck for, almost 2 or 3 days or almost a week. I'm like, oh, there were cards I wanted to change. I just never do. And every time I look at my sideboard, I'm like, oh, I don't want this card. Why do I have this card? Or, oh, that was a replacement for something. I don't have the other copies of something. Even if I net deck something, and I'm like, oh, well, I don't want to actually spend the wild cards on all of those mythics, so I'm just going to not do that card, and I threw in some random ones. And then I have been playing with that deck for 2 weeks. I'm like, oh, my God, I should not be playing this card at all. So just make a practice of when you play a game and you go back to your home screen, just click on your decks and go into your deck and look at it. Just try to get that.
So many times that I'm in the next match. I'm like, right, I wanted to change this.
And before you can hit the cancel button, it just matches you. I'm like, okay, well,
of course,
here's another 30,
time.
45 minutes. So, and then you just kind of forget what you were going to do.
And
so just get used to just going to just clicking on your deck and looking at it in between matches, because I think that will really help you get the wheels turning and churning.
You'll remember.
Yeah, for sure.
And the only other thing I wanted to mention in this stage is that we've been kind of harping on how a lot of people just slap a deck together, go in, lose a few games, and then call it quits. I want to emphasize that that's also okay if, for example, you thought there was some combo that just doesn't work. You don't think you have to now I got to try and do what they told me and go through this next step. Some decks, it can even be, I played a few games and I had no fun at all. I did not enjoy my own deck. I don't want to continue with this. Yeah. That is fine, right? But, if you're doing that on every single deck you build, then maybe there's a sort of
pattern.
It's in your head. Something's going on in your head that you just don't, you're not prepared for the losing that's going to happen in the stage. Make sure it's not just because you're losing to tier 1 decks that you're giving up on it. Yeah. There should be some sort of external reason. It wasn't as fun as I thought. This combo didn't work the way I thought.
Yeah, it's that play pattern is actually more awkward. I thought it would lead really well into each other, but it's not. Yeah. It doesn't.
I do this all the time. I brew a deck, and then I'm like, ooh, that doesn't actually really work. Never mind.
Yeah, and you're like, let's get away from that. So, which is great. Just don't keep playing that deck forever if you know that it's not very good and you need to work on it, but just don't change. Don't keep playing it and not changing it. Like, keep an active brain and try to find the pieces and keep working is what we're mainly focusing on. Which leads us into the third stage or step of the brewing process of how to brew. This is the lautering step.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So what is this when it comes to beer?
Yeah.
So I open my mash, which you'll remember is steeping the grains in hot liquid after an hour or so. Now it's time to get rid of the grains and get that sweet barley water that I want to turn into beer. Of course, you could just strain it somehow, right? You could just pour it through some sort of giant strainer into a big pot, and you'll have your water, and then you can get rid of your grains. If you do that, though, you're leaving a lot of sugar in the grains. So the steeping process, the mash, did not get out all of the sugars. And so if you do this and you want to hit a certain final alcohol percentage, because that has to do with how much sugars you extract, you're going to spend money on a lot more grains than you need. So the lautering process, lautering technically just means getting that water out of the grains, but there's various things you can do to extract more sugar out of the grains on the way. So this involves basically, it's kind of cool. You basically pour the beer over the grains again. The grains will have solidified kind of on top into something called a grain bed, and then you'll use that to filter the beer by recirculating it around, and then you'll see it get less cloudy as you do this. Then once it's nice and clear, you take your first portion, that's called the first runnings, and this is basically the main portion of your beer. You have your first runnings, it's a few gallons or whatever of really concentrated sweet barley water that's going to make most of what your beer is. Then you run more hot water through the wet grains, and these will travel through the grains and pick up the excess sugars that are still left in them, and you're basically going to top up this core, this first runnings that make the sort of core of your beer. You're going to top that up to the volume you want with this hot water running through the grains that picks up the extra sugars.
Nice, because everyone knows that we want to have as much sugar as possible, because then that turns into alcohol, and having high alcohol content is good.
It's called sparging, by the way, when you run the hot water through the grains.
But the whole process we were talking about is lautering, which is what we are naming this third step. And so as far as like building decks go, what is the lautering process then?
So in the lautering process is when I feel like I have my first runnings. So the core of my beer or of my deck that's really going to dictate everything. So in this case, it's, maybe, I don't want to give a precise number of cards, but I don't know, maybe like 20-ish cards or 12 to 20, non-land cards that are really what I consider the core of my deck. This is what makes the deck run. This is what the deck is going to be about. What I have to figure out is the last sort of 8-ish, let's say 8 to 10 or whatever cards that are going to be, that's when I'm running the water through my grains and picking up that extra sweetness that I may have left behind, So I have my core, and I'm just adding some extra sweetness to it to try and really get it to a cohesive whole.
Yeah. And so this stage is still focusing on the main deck, but we're starting to get closer and closer to the main deck body, like that 60 cards that you're going to have in your list. That's what we're getting closer and closer to. Like, if you think of the core as like I guess I'm holding up my hands as like it's a circle, and it's slowly getting bigger and bigger as it's like pushing against the edges of that box that's going to be your deck. You're very, very close. There's a couple of things on the sides that you're like tweaking and working, but your main game plan, you like it, and you've been working on it, and you keep cycling through it essentially.
So I have a deck in this stage that's my teamer draw 2 kind of deck built around Improbable Alliance and Teferi, Hero of Dominaria.
That's the one that used to be the Song of Creation deck, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I know my core here. It's Teferi. I actually call it Teamer Teferi. It's Teferi. It's Improbable Alliance. It's Eureka Moment is the the draw 2 on your opponent's turn also lets you ramp. That's really the reason we're playing green and is core to the deck. It's Prismari Command as a way to draw 2 on your opponent's turn as well. And so basically that's your teamer control kind of shell that's going in. And it has these synergies of discard, drawing and discard. There's a lot of looting going on. And so now I'm trying to find the other cards that play well with that, that are good with. So, you can consider Riel, which lets you draw cards anytime you discard cards. And that kind of stuff, which I consider a little peripheral to the plan, but I'm trying to find the best assortment of those peripheral cards to support this, maybe 16 card core, 20 card core that I know is the deck.
Exactly. Yeah. And it is important to note this is like you might have a little bit more of your sideboard, but we're still not there yet. We're not talking so much about your sideboard. So once again, if it's like 2 things in a row, just kind of forget about it. We're not focused on that. But it's the main work on the body of that that main deck.
And you're starting to figure out, okay, maybe I want 5 removal spells in my main deck or whatever.
You're starting to do number things. Your mana base is getting really solid because now you're starting to know all the different color pips that you're going to have. So now you can create your mana base.
Exactly. Now that you know your core, you can create the mana base a lot better. The reason I don't recommend working too hard on the mana base in the mash is a lot of the ideas that a lot of cards are cycling in and out and changing, and your color requirements are changing as you do that. So
you don't want to have to change your mana base completely every time you add some new stuff.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you add a new color, that will change. But
and in the mash, you probably don't even know how many lands you want. Like you'll play a bunch of games where you keep getting mana screwed, but I'll throw in another land. And you'll find that sweet spot. Okay, I like 27.
Yeah. So once we get out of that phase, then you're loudering when you're like, okay, my mana base feels pretty solid. I'm not moving as many cards around. It's kind of just more a numbers game. That's what I'm working on a bit more. Maybe there's something that you missed originally or you're going back to that you had seen in the mash phase. And you're like, okay, actually, 1 copy of this card would be good in the main deck for this reason or whatever.
Exactly. And just as far as building mana bases go, because I think you're right, this is kind of when it happens in this phase. I just wanted to mention that Frank Karsten wrote an article for Channel Fireball that you can go find. It's how many colored sources do I need to consistently cast my spells on time? And so he did like a statistical analysis. I think it involves the London Mulligan, but it might be pre-London Mulligan. So, but anyway, either way, it's a really good guideline. And what he did is, some statistical analysis for, okay, if you want to have access to 1-drops, like on turn 1, you want to have untapped green mana to play your 1-drop, and you want that to happen over 95% of the time or 90% of the time. He selects a cutoff that he thinks is reasonable, but he gives you information to choose your own cutoff if you want. He'll say you need 14 untapped green sources to consistently play your green 1-drop. Oh, you want to play Wrath of God consistently on turn 4, you need 18 white sources. So those are really good guidelines. Find your bottleneck points, like Wrath of God is, or if you have one red or 1 black card that you need to play on turn 3, then find that, and that'll tell you I need at least this many black sources if I want to do that consistently. Yeah,
that's great. And specifically for people who aren't great at like math and statistics and probability and all that stuff, having a chart, amazing.
Yeah, he did all the math for you. So, and I even use it because why should I have to do the math every time?
Seems once again, why would you do work that somebody else already did? Right, you should just might as well stand on top of their shoulders. It's just a lot better. So actually, we'll probably find that article and put it in the show notes. So check that out.
Yeah, I use it as a guideline, so I don't follow it like as close as possible. Sometimes I think his estimates are a bit low. I would like more sources than he's suggesting in some cases, but that might just be a personal preference thing. Like it might be that he's pulled the numbers for hitting it 90% of the time, and I want to hit it more than 90% of the time.
Exactly.
Or whatever.
Yeah. So use it like you use most things with a grain of salt. That's always a good idea.
But it's very valuable because sometimes you're just sitting there like, do I have enough black? I don't know. And Frank Karsten will tell you, you have 16 black and you need 19. You're like, oh, no. Well, no, I don't.
Yeah.
But then you'll also see I have 22 blue, and he's suggesting I have 20 blue. So, okay, cut 2 blue sources. Replace with some black sources.
Great. Well, now that we're at the halfway point of our brewing process, I think it's time to brew up some more beer. No, we're not brewing more beer. I just need to go get more.
Well, no, we'll just pour some that we already have.
Yeah, I'll pour some more that you already brewed because it takes too long
Yeah.
to do it otherwise. Anyway, that's our beer noises because we have growlers of the beer. Of red beer wins.
Exactly.
Yes. So good. We need to, that needs to be like a label. We need to sell that.
I can design a label for it.
Yeah. Yeah, you can do the...
That'll be our Patreon.
So we are going into the fourth step of our how to brew process, and this is the boil.
Yeah, so when last we left off, we had some delicious sweet barley water that we had extracted every ounce of sugar from our grains as we could. We then discarded those grains, gave them to a local farm or something, because I hear that animals eat it. And now we have just this awesome water that's full of sugar. So what we do at this point is this is when we add the hops, basically. Or any other aromatics you might want. This is where you would add spices if you were doing that, stuff like that. You bring the water to a boil. That boiling process is going to break down the hop, whether using flowers or pellets. It's going to break it down and leave. So hops have this acid in them. And so the longer you boil a hop for, the more aroma and flavor gets boiled off, and the more just acid from the hop is in your beer.
Interesting.
And that acid is that bittering flavor that we all know from
drinking
hops bitter beer. Yeah. That's what gives it that. So the hops that you use for bittering go in at the start, and then as you get later in the, let's say, 1 hour boil, you'll add stuff that you actually want to be able to smell or taste later and later, depending on how much of it you want to be bittering and how much of it you want to be aroma.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah. I like that. Similar to, this isn't exactly the same, but like in coffee, when you're roasting, the darker roast of coffee has more flavor but less caffeine, and the lighter roast of coffee has more caffeine but usually a lighter flavor.
Yeah, people are always surprised when I tell them that dark roast is actually less caffeine because it tastes stronger, I guess, so people associate that with a coffee, caffeine thing.
But it's similar to like if you're cooking vegetables for a really long time, the nutrients get cooked out of it. Same thing with roasting. Caffeine is like a nutrient of the coffee that gets kind of roasted off. Similar to this, where like some of the aromas from your hops will get kind of lost and you'll be left with some more acidic things. Hey, look at all this stuff that, means the same thing. But moving into how that relays back to talking about decks. So now we're in the fourth stage, and we are working on... That's my drum roll. It's pretty bad.
The sideboard.
Sideboard.
Yeah.
So we've been talking about, hey, remember that sideboard? Forget about it for a few steps now. This is finally the time. Hey, let's start thinking about this 15-card sideboard.
Right. So I have my wort, which is my wing. That's what we call the the final sweet barley water. The technical word for it is a wort. Mm-hmm. So now we have this, and we're trying to add stuff to bring out the characteristics in that wort that we want, whether that's some bitterness on the top or some aroma. We're just trying to kind of accentuate that. And this is really where a lot of the beer kind of comes together, because the body of the beer is going to just kind of taste, it's going to taste like a whatever beer that you made. So if it's a pale ale, you made a pale ale. But this is where you can really decide what the first thing people are going to notice about your beer, or how it's going to taste at the end of their palate.
It's some of the the selling points. It's like, these are the fun extra words we're adding before we say IPA and all that kind of stuff.
And the reason I think that's so important is because your sideboard is actually much more deterministic to the success of your deck than I think most people think. It's really obvious, but sometimes it needs pointing out. But when you play a match of Magic, there are at least as many sideboard games as non-sideboard games. Right? So generally, there's at least one of each, but usually there's 2 sideboard games and only 1 game played with the main deck. So whoever has the better sideboard is at a huge advantage because 2/3 of the games are being played with those sideboarded cards. So don't skimp on the sideboard. This is like being the best main deck in the format is fine. That is a good advantage because you give yourself a good shot to win game 1. But if you're a total underdog in games 2 and 3, it's not worth that much to win game 1.
Yeah.
You lose the match 2-1, it's the same as losing the match 2-0.
Exactly.
I mean, not really. There's breakers.
Yeah, but you know what we're talking about, right?
Right.
Obviously, you're trying to win your match, and your sideboard is huge. You never want to be in a position where you're like, wow, I wish I had anything. I don't even know what I'm going to put in this. I'm just kind of screwed against this deck no matter what.
This is why I love green-black based mid-range decks, because traditionally these decks are excuse me. Traditionally these decks have been known to be like, they're called the 40-60 deck because they're 40% to win game 1 against almost anyone, but then they're 60% to win games 2 and 3 against almost anyone, because their core strategy is just fine, but it's not hyper linear or anything. So in game 1 they have a chance, but they're an underdog because they're just kind of playing good cards. But their sideboard cards are so good and so varied that they become a favorite in the post-board games against almost anyone. And that's why these decks have seen so much success over the years. Like Jund had a point in time where you could never beat it because it just had such good sideboard cards.
Yeah. So now, like, just knowing that, like, it's really easy to go in thinking, oh, sideboard's just like, it's kind of there. But no, it's actually extremely important. And these are the ways that you beat depending on what deck you're up against. Obviously, you would want to technically build your deck differently. So that's kind of where it came from, where it's like, well, I would add this card, but it's not good against any deck besides this one deck. So that's why I want it in my sideboard or whatever, and kind of why they were built originally in the first place, why you have a 15-card sideboard. It's not just like, it wasn't just a random rule that they decided to have. Like, there's a reason you have it, and there's a reason it's that many cards.
Yeah.
And all of those things.
And that's kind of a good lead-in to one of the main things I wanted to talk about here is that so many times when I see people build sideboards, they literally just jam their sideboard full of cards that are known to be good sideboard cards. It's like we're playing black, we play Duress in our sideboard. We play some Soul Guide Lanterns for Graveyard Hate. We play a couple extra Eliminates to fight off aggro. Maybe we play a sweeper or 2, depending on what kind of deck we're playing. And that's, I think, a fine way to build your sideboard for the mash when you're just testing stuff and you don't really know what's going on with your deck yet. But that is not really how you should be building a sideboard. Here's what I recommend as the first step. What you want to do is, let's just get out a piece of paper and let's write out what you consider to be the 5 top decks in the format. What are most people going to be playing? So if I had to say it right now for standard, let's say, I would say the top 5 decks, in no particular order, the order doesn't matter that much, are Sultimatum, Dimir Rogues, and then the next 3 are all Adventures decks, I think. So let's say Temur Adventures, Gruul Adventures, and Naya Adventures. But,
wow.
I mean, not
even giving any love to Red Deck wins, or
I don't think Red Deck
or cycling. Wow, I don't know how.
But okay, you should include those as well because the Adventures cores are similar.
Yes.
So
maybe
and five was just a number I said.
Yeah,
but all the decks you actually expect to run into.
Yeah, of course.
And then you look at your main deck, and let's say next to Sultimatum, I just want to start writing down the cards that are in my main deck that are bad cards against Sultimatum. This is your Eliminate. This is your like Essence Scatter type stats only okay. Basically, creature removal is going to in general be quite bad against Sultimatum, or anything that's an expensive permanent that's just going to get cleaned up really advantageously by binding the old gods. Like, these are the types of cards that are bad. Okay, so write out all the cards you have that are bad, and do this for each matchup. Now, your puzzle when you're building the sideboard is to be able to replace every single one of these bad cards with something that is at least passable in the matchup, but hopefully good. So I'm going to have 5 or 6 bad cards against Ultimatum. Maybe I'm a little better against Adventures. I only have 4 bad cards against Adventures. Probably going to have 5 cards that are too slow to keep up with mono red, So it doesn't add up to 15. It usually adds up to more than 15. So this is why it's a puzzle. You have to figure out, okay, what cards pull double duty, what's good against red, and is at least pretty good against Ultimatum or something, Mm-hmm. Well, probably not that, because those are polar opposite decks.
Exactly, but that kind of thing. But basically, knowing and having a plan. So when you go to sideboard, you're not trying to invent it at that moment. You've already made a plan. Like when I play against Ultimatum, I know what my sideboard plan is. Another way you can look at it, besides looking at your deck and seeing which ones, 6 cards or whatever are bad for your deck, you can also make it so that when you build your deck, or you're looking at your deck builder on Arena, you can have 5 different versions of that deck, right? You have, this is the version that I would play. If I could only play this version of this deck against like Ultimatum in like a best of 1, this is the deck I would pick, right? Oh, this is the deck I would play against Rogues. This is the deck I would play against Mono Red. This is the deck I would play against Adventures or whatever. And then seeing the similarities and start to try to make as many of those cards that are like the fringe bits, the same cards, and then find that, oh, these are the 15 that I can use, and then go that way. Trying both of those kinds of techniques, it's the same thing, but maybe you're more of a visual learner that needs to have separate things separated like that. Mm-hmm. But it is the idea that like when you go into a matchup, you already know what's the dead card in your deck. Maybe the Disdainful Stroke is the thing that you're like, great, this card's useless in my main deck, but it's useless in this matchup, but I have a 1 of in my main deck for the matchup that's not great, that I really need it for. And you'll see this with pros have this all the time. Like in I think in the what was that championship? It was at the beginning of Zendikar Rising. And I can't remember who it was. It might be some player in the top 8, but they basically like held up their Disdainful Stroke and was like flashing it around, being like, "This is the dead card. I can't play this against anything in their deck because they're playing Lurrus." It's like there are 0 cards. I can't. This card's useless
by design. Their deck is not going up to 4 mana.
So that's kind of like those kinds of things. But like obviously these are kind of decisions that you're making, and that you might have some dead cards in your main deck to certain matchups, maybe just one matchup, but know that you have a better chance beating this other matchup that's much worse if you put it in your main deck. All those kinds of things. Right. And obviously your main deck we've already talked about in the last section.
And this is what makes constructing a sideboard so interesting, because what you'll find is that it's not possible. You're going to have 7 or 8 decks. You're going to have 5 to 6 bad cards in each matchup. You only have 15 cards. Mm-hmm. You can do your best, but sometimes you might just have to sacrifice a matchup too and hope that
you don't
people aren't playing that.
Yeah. Just be like, hey, okay, I'm just betting. This matchup isn't... I'm just crossing my fingers I don't get matched up against it, and I doubt that many people are going to play it. So my deck would be... If my deck would be like just like infinitely better if I just forgot about that matchup altogether, maybe I do that.
Right.
And free up all the slots for the decks I actually need to work on, and just say, hey, if I get matched up against that, that's a loss. And it just sucks when that happens.
Yeah, and I think I would go so far as to say if the format is good and healthy, that will happen. That should happen too. Mm-hmm. Like, you shouldn't be able to build a deck that is just a champion against every other deck in the format, Like,
yeah,
you should have good and bad matchups, and sometimes your matchup is so bad that it's not even worth dedicating sideboard slots to. Mm-hmm. Like, what's the point of turning a 20% matchup into a 30% one if it's going to sacrifice your 50 or 60% matchups,
And so the other thing is like, this is the time, throughout this whole process, you need to be very honest with yourself and be like, hey, it's hard to say like, hey, you don't, just because you have a 10% chance to win this match doesn't mean it's good. Or like should keep playing it or something, right? Maybe you just can't win that matchup, and that's just it.
Actually, especially in a long tournament, like don't use brain power on something that is. I mean, this is person specific. I know great players have landed on either side of this. Like Reed Duke almost never concedes and tries to find every line he can that gives him a chance to win. And then I've heard players like Ben Starks say, like, it's just not worth it for them because they might spend, like, too much time and energy trying to figure out this 7% game, and that might cost them a game down the line that was, like, a 50 or 60% game because they're tired, So
you're, like,
people
tired
land on either side of this, but...
Mentally, you're tired. Maybe you didn't get to use the washroom like you needed to. You were hungry. All those kinds of things happen in not just online tournaments, but in person as well. Where you're like, I could spend all time doing this and then spend another chunk of like an hour playing my next matches, and it's gonna be too much. It's not really worth it. Just move on. So realizing that earlier and earlier, I think. Can be helpful. I mean, obviously, we're not saying, "Hey, just concede if it's a bad matchup," but
yeah. But the thing to take away from this is to be really thoughtful and deliberate when you have a deck you like, and now it's time to construct the sideboard. And I really like this idea of just every bad card I have, because drawing a dead card really kills you in a matchup. It's like, it's like mulliganing. And sometimes you'll then mulligan into a hand that has two bad cards in it. You're like, oh,
well then this has nothing. And realize those things, like if you end a match with a card in your hand you had from the beginning and you never played it, maybe that's a card that you didn't need for that matchup if you went through the whole game and never had to use it. Or just
or like you're saying, I see a ton of people with cards that are good in a matchup that they're already really favored in, I remember back in the day, Sultimatum players often had hate for Rakdos in their sideboard, like graveyard hate for Rakdos. I was like, you are already destroying Rakdos so easily. Don't waste sideboard slots on this.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to bring up an example of like how this kind of comes into practice. You see this in the pros all the time. Some people might wonder why the pros are so high on Cling to Dust. And the reason is that, like, because Cling to Dust is not the best graveyard hate. And it's also not the best life gain card. But the fact that it does both for 1 mana at instant speed means that it's not that embarrassing to play this against an aggro deck. Because you just exile a creature that you've killed from their graveyard, gain 3 life in a pinch. And it's not embarrassing to play this against cards that use the graveyard. And it's not embarrassing to play this against rogues, for example, because it has escape. So this is a card that doesn't really do anything particularly well, but it's such a coveted sideboard card because it's an upgrade over your worst card in like 3 or 4 different matchups.
Like the worst thing it can do is just cycle itself for 1 mana.
Cycle, yeah. And you have the option of gaining 3 life instead. Like obviously you would never play 1 black mana instant speed, gain 3 life.
Yeah.
But hey, when you need that life, you will play it. When when you're getting attacked for lethal, it looks pretty good.
So I do like what you said about knowing which matchups you're like really great against and not having to overkill them because there's no reason to. Like your sideboard should be helping you against matchups that you're bad against, not ones that you're hoping to.
Or 50-50. Like
or 50-50
try to be the breaker in a 50-50 matchup.
But just again, sideboards are super important, and you should spend time building it and writing it down. I think is big. Going into a tournament, especially when there's a bunch of things going on or whatever. I mean, I don't have a ton of experience, but when I was doing my tournaments, I had a sideboard guide that I made for myself prior to it, just because I knew there were other factors I didn't have in my control, and the one thing I wanted to be able to be great at or know about was my deck, right? Especially, and also like Grzegorz Kowalski, he always posts great.
Follow him on Twitter.
Follow him on Twitter because he'll post a deck and his entire like sideboard guide just to be like, hey, this is some stuff, and go check it out. See how he does it. It's amazing. Like,
and it'll even come with like a brief metagame analysis of what he considers the best decks, where he thinks this deck lands in that like metagame.
yeah,
You
because
could see everything we're talking about in one of his Twitter posts because he's so thoughtful about what he's doing with
exactly.
every deck that he
So you
plays.
can read that really quickly. You could listen to us for an hour and a half and be like, "Oh, okay, I've learned some stuff." But you literally just like read one.
No,
Twitter
see,
post.
they listen to us and then they go through and then they're like, okay, this is what the deck looks like in the boil, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So you can see those kinds of things, but just the boil is the time to figure out your sideboard and start really thinking about meta. In the recipe phase, you think about meta just as your beginning, but this is the time where you're actually trying to figure out, okay, where am I going to fit in this, and how do I combat the other decks I will be really playing against?
Right. And hopefully you were honest in the recipe phase when you said, what decks am I just naturally going to lose to because my game plan is weak against that game plan.
Or you're like, hey, that deck was just for fun. I like playing, mono
like this is something I
green.
should have said in the recipes thing again, I guess, but it's worth bringing up that I see on Twitter, on Reddit all the time on the Spikes Reddit for competitive Magic. Someone posts a new brew and they say, "Oh, this deck's a bit weak to aggro, but is strong against the rest of the field." All the time, everybody thinks their home brew is only bad against aggro and is good against everything else that other people are playing. These are people that are not being honest with themselves. If you think your deck beats Sultimatum, it beats Gruul Adventures, it beats Teamer Adventures, it beats Mono White, it loses only to Mono Red, you're not being honest with yourself.
Yeah,
It
100%.
just doesn't do that. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Also, just
So I always take those deck lists with a grain of salt because they're not really thinking about the matchups. They've just won a couple of matches.
Exactly.
And have declared it favored.
Yeah, and I think that kind of moves us into our fifth phase, which is fermenting. So in beer, Jeff, would you like to take the reins on this one? Because I'm just going to add every beer thing to you.
Yeah, I think everybody knows what this phase is about. You add the yeast, and the yeast eats that sugar that we had in the beer, and it expels carbon dioxide and also alcohol.
Yeah.
So at this point, we're not carbonating, so we're not super concerned with the carbon dioxide. We're concerned about the alcohol it's putting into our beer.
Exactly. It's like the yeast is eating sugar and just farting out alcohol, or pooping it out, I guess.
Yeah.
So this is when you take your deck and then you pour yeast on it, and it eats all the cards that you worked so well making the sugar swell.
Yeah. Please don't do this with your very expensive cards at home.
Or your computer or your keyboard.
We will not be responsible.
Yeah, we are not part of that.
So the thing about fermentation, and that's why I wanted to have this step be this step, is that no matter how well you did the previous phases, your beer's quality will be it's now make or break depending on whether the fermentation is good or bad. Like, you could have done everything else perfectly. If you have a bad fermentation, your beer sucks. And if you only did okay previously, but you had a really good fermentation, your beer's going to be good. So this is like the most important stage. Previously, we were deciding the characteristics of our beer.
Mm-hmm.
Is it going to have this maltiness? Is it going to have these hops, this flavor? Now we're deciding, is the beer good or not, basically. And so for Magic, for me, this is just practicing with your deck. Learn how to play the deck that you now have.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're a terrible player with a great deck, it doesn't really matter how good the deck is. You know?
It doesn't matter how long you spent building your deck and putting the pieces together if you can't play it. Like playing, and we've harped on this many, many times before.
Right.
But it's important to be part of the brewing process as well, because you need to practice with that deck.
You need to know the different interactions in your deck. There's always weird stuff with every Magic deck. Even in mono red aggro. Oh, hey, look, do I know that when I attack with Faceless Haven, I'm allowed to play cards that I exiled previously with Robber of the Rich, because Faceless Haven is technically a rogue. Knowing that interaction
could come up,
or not knowing that interaction could decide a game.
Mm-hmm. Random niche things like that. The more you play, the more random stuff you have. Obviously, this is really important if you're like net decking is like all you're doing is practicing. Kind of if you net deck, you just jump straight to this point.
Right. Someone else has done the boil for you.
Yeah, they did all the other parts, and you just have to learn how to play. But just because you built a deck doesn't mean you know how to play. You know how it's supposed to function, but there might be like the off cards that like you didn't think really, or you know that they like works together because you've been going through this whole process. But like there might be corner cases where you're like, this is actually better than playing my engine right now or whatever, because you've put in the hours. And so the fermentation is the time to like you need to put the hours into your brew.
Right. And at the start, I was talking about why I wanted to play Control and Historic, and this is why, because I've played enough Control that I felt like I would be able to pilot that deck with some confidence, rather than, if I play Dimir Rogues, I have to know stuff really. Like, I've played Rogues before in Standard, but in Historic, it's a whole different thing, because Rogues is all about knowing your opponent's deck very well and responding basically perfectly to it. Control is like, I knew when to commit another, like even if I have a board wipe coming up, I know when I need to commit another removal spell to the board because it's too much damage, and when it's not, and stuff like that, because I've played years of playing Control. Mm-hmm. So that's why I picked that deck, is because I know that I could pilot it better.
Yeah.
And we've seen like we said if your deck is great but you're bad, you're going to lose a lot. We've seen the opposite, where some players have brought some pretty suspicious decks to some great tournaments, but because they are so good and know the deck so well, they can still win. Like Reed Duke brought Abzan, I think, to one of the Pro Tours, and he top 8'd, and everyone in the world would have told you that Abzan was a terrible deck in Modern at that time, because it just had bad matchups against everything that was popular. But because he was so good with the deck, it was better for him to bring that than to bring Storm, which I think is what the rest of his team played, because he was so much better with Abzan than with Storm.
Yeah. And also, this is the time to realize, maybe you don't know your play style yet. Maybe you're building decks and you're like, this just seems really cool. And then the more you play and you put in hours and hours, you're like, you might end up realizing that you think the deck is good, but you don't like playing it. Or different things like that. Like, this is a big thing if you're net decking, because you're like,
sure, yeah,
going to be playing a lot from decks that you don't build, but like this is going to be the same step in both of those situations. If you brewed it, you've put in a ton of hours to it already, but this is not the time where you're wanting to like change stuff, right? This is the time where you're like, everything's made, like you're done building it. Basically, you are just practicing and practicing. And playing it is interesting. Like even Arne Huschenbett, who has like recently won the Call Time Championship, like you need to know that if you're playing Emergent Ultimatum against that deck, in that matchup, you just don't have to play anything for the first like 4 turns. Like, maybe the best way to counter their removal spells is not to play anything and then screw them up later.
Yeah, and the specific interaction you're referring to is to not get hit by Elspeth's Nightmare. Because if you give them a target for it, it now comes down, it kills your Thieves Guild Enforcer, and then it also duresses you, and it's just an amazing card. And you saw Arna time and time again not play Thieves Guild Enforcer because he knew he wouldn't be able to get it up to 4 power before his opponent would get to cast Elspeth's Nightmare, and that would make that card too strong.
So you wait, yeah. So he's waiting until he can make that 3 power or more so that Elspeth's Nightmare can't hit it.
And that's not a play you make without practice.
Exactly. That's like a master play where you're like, this is my deck. I know it better than my opponent. I know it better than everybody else. That's why I'm here, and that's why I'm winning right now. And that's where you want to put
His play
yourself.
was just phenomenal, that whole event. But
yeah. And so that's where you want to be. Like, maybe the plays you're making don't make a lot of sense unless you've played that deck over and 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 over again.
Yeah.
And so this is the time that you're fermenting this deck and you're getting through all the pieces. And maybe you're playing a matchup you've played hundreds of times. And you're like, okay, well, I know what they're going to have. Probably their best hand is probably this. And so it has to be that one moment where you're like, you know what? What if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, quote unquote, and I do it differently?
Don't do the quote unquote obvious play. What happens if I
what
don't
if I
do that?
do it differently? What if I play the game making them think I have a card I don't have? That's when you start to get to that situation, right?
No. What happens when you do that is you draw that card. And then they were right to play around it. They'll continue to play.
Of course.
You're like, no, my bluff failed again.
But yeah, this is the time, like, of course we're not going to have a how to brew a deck without saying, hey, you should be good at playing.
Yeah.
We just like,
but we did need to bring it up because I think people often refer to like, oh, I can't believe, no skill red deck, that's why he won or something. It's like, people win. There are players who win with mono red even when nobody else can win with mono red.
Yeah.
Why? Because every deck takes skill
and it's
to master.
I also think it's really important to talk about when we're saying brewing decks, because when you make the deck and the sideboard and everything's finished, you still have to be able to play it, or otherwise it's just cards. Like, it's not a deck yet. You have to be able to play your deck, or it's just a list that doesn't matter. And that you can look at any list and not understand how it goes together and fumble through it, but it's not a deck, right? So this is where you're actually sharpening your tools and you're being able to use it the way it's supposed to be used and the way you built it to be used.
Right. And I don't want to say that you can't enter a competitive event before you've done this. Like, hey, go for it. I played at a competitive event last week with my Temur Teferi deck.
Yeah, do whatever you want.
As I mentioned previously, that's still in the Loudering. Like, that was a slap together sideboard. But it's just, for me, it was more faithful testing. It was more faithful Loudering than I would get on the ladder. So I was like, hey, why not?
Yeah, see, and
because the players I'm going to play against are a bit better than
exactly. And if you go into it, and once again, if you go into it knowing that that's what you're doing, then that's a great practice exercise, right?
Yeah, I went 2-3, by the way, so there you go. I was losing.
Yeah.
But every match felt close, and I felt like there was stuff I could do differently or cards I could change to maybe have affected the outcome of that match. So I think I learned a lot, actually.
Exactly. And that's what that phase is for. That's great. That's perfect.
Like, my opponent just slapped down an Elder Gargaroth, and I remember thinking, like, I don't really have any way to beat Elder Gargaroth in my entire deck. Like, I could phase it out for a turn with Teferi, but
that's about it. Yeah. But, sometimes you need those opponents to help you.
Not a card I thought about.
Yeah.
Or Coma, I also learned, is literally unbeatable for my deck. So.
Yeah, well, that card's just amazing. But, however, moving away from fermenting, the last stage that we have for this whole thing and for our beer is, of course, one of the most important ones. And what would that be, Jeff?
Let's go with kegging.
Kegging sounds good.
Yeah, I like kegging. We weren't sure kegging, bottling, canning. These are all, but putting out the final product.
It sounds, yeah. So you fermented it. There's some filtering that goes on, and a couple other quality control things. But for the most part, everything's finished, and you're ready to share this with the world.
That's right.
So that your deck is let's go in beer terms as we started off. You're just ready to share it with your friends and your family and get kind of drunk. Like you did so much work. That is.
Yeah, we didn't give me the chance to explain what kegging is in beer terms. It means putting your beer in a keg.
Oh yeah, sorry if you don't know what that is already. A keg is a large steel. I don't know, barrel that you use. But anyway.
Yeah, I guess. It's a modern barrel.
It's like a modern barrel. But anyway, this is when you just, this is the fun part. This is this is the chance where you get to take your deck and you're like, you know what? I'm going to post this on Twitter. I get to show that I got to Mythic with it. This is, I was in this tournament. I get to do that. Or this is me. Finally, I kegged it. I can bring it to a tournament. All those kinds of things.
Whatever this means for you, right? Like being proud of this awesome deck that you've accomplished.
You get to post this in your group chat of your friends that play or whatever. You're like, I did it. It's done. I completed it.
One of the awesome goals for arena players is to build a deck and then get to Mythic or Diamond or whatever is, the highest you've been with a deck that you built. That's a really great feeling. And I promise you can do that. Like, you can build a deck and get to Mythic with that deck. You don't have to net deck to get to Mythic. And then you get to post that, like you're saying, share it with your friends. Hey, guys, I got to Mythic. And
with the brew that I made up.
Awesome.
Yeah. I've been talking about this for a while. I finally got the right pieces. I did it. I practiced a lot. I did this whole stuff, and I got there.
Post it to Reddit. Be honest about its good and bad matchups. I'll give you a like.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Send it to us. Please send it to us on Twitter and Instagram at Arena Regulars. We would love to see all of your brews that you're working on. And tell us what either, if you get it kegged, that's awesome. That's a huge accomplishment in itself, is just to keg a deck. But if you're in a mash, if you're in a lauter or a boil, if you're just fermenting it for hours and hours, please tell us all that kind of stuff. Even if it's just a recipe, you thought that was cool, hit us up. We would love to talk to you about it. And
yeah, I guess that's the thing I didn't mention, but I was hoping was obvious. But fermenting takes the longest.
Yes, yes. As far as beer goes, fermenting does take the longest, and in deck playing.
Exactly. In deck playing, it also takes a long time.
It also takes the longest amount of time.
The one thing I want to add to kegging, though, is that this doesn't mean that all is done. Because after you keg the beer, you wait, you taste it, you make changes to the recipe. So you should still be fixing your deck.
Yeah. Maybe you don't start all over again, but when you're, you'll probably learn a lot from this process, and you'll learn a lot from like brewing your own beer, or cooking a meal, or anything that you do that you've worked all this, put all this effort into. The next time you do it, you're gonna have a lot more, ideas, or you've just learned things to make it better this next time, or maybe go faster, or all that kind of stuff.
You'll be more efficient.
Or maybe you realize, hey, that style of deck, not really my jam. Maybe I should.
Not for me.
You know what? Maybe I really like hyper-aggressive linear decks, and that's totally awesome. Do that.
Yeah, and I think there's if you like decks, you tend to play them better too.
Yeah.
I actually don't really know anyone who's like, oh, I'm awesome with aggro decks, but I really hate aggro decks. Well, I'm sure there are people out there that are really good at a style of deck, but just hate it. But for the most part, fun and skill, how good you're going to get, are intertwined, because if you're having a fun with the deck, you're going to play it more.
Exactly.
And then you're going to win more, which is going to make you have more fun. So it kind of works both ways.
Yeah. And also, just be honest. There's no... people like to make a stigma about, oh, these decks are harder or better or whatever, and we've talked about this over and over again, but I went through this, I was the friend in my friend group when I was a kid who didn't really play aggressive decks, and my friends were doing that, and I always thought I'd be much cooler or better if I did all this other shenanigans. And then I realized, maybe I just like hyperlinear decks that are, more focused. And, and that was awesome. And
Which is funny, because as a kid, I was Boros aggro Lightning Helix guy.
Yeah.
And now I think aggro is one of my worst archetypes.
And it's one of my best.
That I pilot.
Yeah. And you just be honest with yourself. And obviously all these archetypes are made for a reason. And we need players of all the different archetypes to make the game work. So... It's wonderful if you like playing any of them. Just please play. That's all we ask.
Yeah.
So, anyway, that is what we think about brewing decks and beer, and that's the process we believe you should be using. But as we talk about beer, my beer is pretty empty, and I think you hear a last call.
I hear something.
Yeah. So we should get beers before we can't buy beers anymore. Well, Jeff, normally we have a whole beer reveal and all that stuff, but
I was ready with my beer off camera. We're not doing that this time?
No, I'm choosing your beer.
Oh, we picked the same one.
Hey, we did. Hey, look at that. It's the only beer we had to choose, but... No, Jeff, I think...
Well, I would have been really offended if you showed up with a Bud Light or something.
That would be great.
Sorry, man, I just couldn't stomach another one.
No, I just can't have 3 of those. No, I think your red beer wins is fantastic. I really like it.
Yeah, thanks.
I have tried one of your beers. Can't remember what it was. It was an unfiltered-ish looking IPA.
I was going to ask if you'd ever tried any of the beers that I've made.
Yeah, we were watching football once.
I think that was one of my less than stellar
I thought that one was good.
Okay.
In either
maybe
case,
it wasn't that. I've had some good ones and some horrible ones. So.
Yeah. In
just
either
like
case,
brewing a deck, you know.
Yeah, this beer is it tastes like a real beer. Wow.
Thank you.
You could sell this in a place.
That's a compliment you're not supposed to give to people.
I know. That's why I wanted to give it to you. So if you don't know, if your friend is a brewer or someone who just makes stuff in general, don't ever
or anything really.
Yeah, just don't give them the compliment. Hey, this looks like a real thing. You could sell this or whatever. It just seems.
Right.
I've definitely done this to other brewer friends that we had, or just people in general. If someone hands you a beer and says, "Hey, I made this beer," and you drink it and say, "Hey, that tastes like a beer," they're like, "Okay, cool. Yes, I know. I gave it to you and I made it. So
do you like it? Or...
Do you like it? What does it taste like?" That's usually what people are looking for. So
obviously your intentions are good, and it's meant as a compliment or whatever. But and if we just be a little more thoughtful about our compliments, then that goes a long way.
Yeah, and usually, hey, this is good enough to sell isn't necessarily the compliment you think it is.
Right. Yeah. There's implications lying there that you didn't mean, but are ways to interpret that.
Exactly. In any case, this is good enough to sell. No,
it hurts even more when I know you're saying it as a dagger.
Yeah. No, I think this beer tastes.
I expected your beer to be terrible.
Tastes real nice. I like it has a little bit of a sweetness, but it's not too sweet. It doesn't have that really honey brown flavor to it, but it has a nice red color, and it's very clear. And there's a bitterness to it that almost has a smoky feel. But I like it. I really like it. I think it's
that's
good.
From the Cara 80, which is a pretty dark malt smoked.
Yeah, but it feels the smoked. Yeah, there you go. So it feels very complex and not just something you want to just obviously I want to drink a bunch of these, but it doesn't. Sometimes, but sometimes there's red ales where you're like, oh, this is good, but I'm just going to throw it back a bunch of times. But this feels like I want to sit with it for a bit. I think this is solid. This feels like platinum diamond range, where I'm I can definitely be in there.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I was going to give it diamond because I'm a little biased, but
of course,
this is one of the better beers that I've made. Usually, when you brew a beer, there's something that doesn't quite come out the way you wanted it to, and this is pretty damn close to what I envisioned. I think the color is perfect, and then the taste. I like the taste. I think I might tone a little bit back the sweetness next time I make the recipe. A few minor changes I want to make. I'm not really getting almost any citrus from the aroma that I described from using those citrus aroma. Or what's the word I'm looking for? Caribbean kind of flavors in the aroma.
Kind of like a tropical feel. Yeah,
tropical. Yeah, that's the word I couldn't think of. I'm not getting any of that, so I might tone that up by half an ounce next time or something. But so there are very minor changes I would make to this, but I'm really happy with the turnout.
Yeah, I think it's great. The only reason I say borderline platinum diamond is because I want you to make it again. And tweak it a little bit. And I just don't want you to stop right where you are and be all right, that's in the bag. I want you to keep working on it and just make more for me.
But I was obviously happy enough with it to give it such a great name.
Of course. So. Yeah. So, you'll have to make more beer. Maybe we'll make one this summer. I don't know. I keep saying that.
Definitely do that. If vaccinations ever reach this part of the world.
Yeah, if Ontario can ever get its shit together, fuck, man. Yeah. Anyway, we don't need to get into that because I'm going to get real sad real fast.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really happy with this, and I honestly do think it competes with some red ales that I've purchased before,
absolutely.
So
I've definitely. I think I've had a worse red ale on the show. For sure.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think I brought a red ale that was much worse. Much worse. Was
now,
terrible.
Obviously, that's part of brewing your own beers. You get to make it to your tastes. So.
And this is real good. I like it. A thumb up and a second one on the way.
It gets a thumb. It gets a thumb up.
A thumb up. Anyway, is it closing time?
I think so.
I think it is. So anyway, it's been a great show. Yeah. Fuck, every time you got to sing that song, I keep forgetting. Oh, man.
I always try to wait for you to start to say something.
So that you can kind of whisper sing over me. Anyway, if you ever want to talk to us and be like, hey, it's weird that Jeff does that while you're talking, you can find us at Arena Regulars on Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah, you might also find us on Arena itself. Under the username Arena Regulars Podcasts. We'll be milling you out with rogues.
Yeah, probably. Also, just so you know, I've been playing that account on my phone. So if it ever like goes really slow or like, I don't know, I can't pick a card for Ultimatum or something, it's because I'm on my phone.
Blame
and
Apple.
Yeah, it's just like tapped out and it won't let me, for whatever reason, it can't handle a full match. So.
You sure it's not because you're BMing and just like pull the plug on them so they have to wait the max amount of time? Come on, be honest.
All right, I have to stop because I have to wipe and then wash my hands before I click the next button. Anyway, if you want to talk to me about how gross it is that I'm playing the Arena account while I'm BMing, I guess, you can find my personal account at Zulberg, Zeulberg on Twitter and Instagram. But Jeff, where can they find you?
You can find me also on Twitter at Blues Brews MTG.
Also, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, iTunes. Follow us on all the things. I can't remember them right now. Spotify, Stitcher, go to our Anchor, whatever. We would just love your feedback. It means a lot to us. And go on YouTube, leave us a comment on some of our videos there.
Even if your review is as simple as Zach, please remember what platforms you're on. That would be really helpful.
Yeah,
to us, so.
yeah, or just anything ridiculous or wow, it's you guys are really drunk like that. That's great. That's all we want. So would mean a lot. This has been the Arena Regulars,
reminding you to always be brewing.
Good night. All right, that's fine.